The scripture reading this morning is from the book of John, chapter 20, verses 24 through 31. But Thomas, who was called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the marks of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas answered him, "My Lord and my God." Jesus said to him, "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. Here ends the reading.
Thank you, Lisa. For probably more than a decade, Barbara Brown Taylor was one of the most popular and influential Protestant preachers in the United States. In the late 1990s, she was actually voted one of the 10 most influential preachers in the United States. And about 10 years later, in the early 2010s, she decided that she would leave the small Episcopal church in North Georgia, where she had served as priest, and take a teaching position at Piedmont College, a small liberal arts school, also in Georgia. She wrote about this book, about this leaving her pastoral ministry to teach, in a book called Leaving Church. And in an interview with Bob Abernathy on PBS's Religion and Ethics News Weekly, Abernathy asked Barbara Brown Taylor if doubt had played a role in her deciding to stop preaching and instead teach at a small liberal arts college. She responded, "Here's the way I presently live with doubt. Doubt often brings me to poke at what I believe. And when it topples, I realize it was an idol. And so doubt has been a divine gift that has led me deeper into God. Doubt brings me to poke at what I believe, and when it topples over, I realize it was an idol I had created. And so doubt has been a divine gift that has led me deeper into God." If you think about it, doubt really is how we learn and grow. Sometimes we forget that to our peril as adults. We get annoyed sometimes at our children or grandchildren when they doubt everything. They want to know, why do I have to brush my teeth? Or why can't I reach inside those bars and pet that pretty tiger? You know, they ask why all the time. It's a good question. It's a sign we're no longer growing when we stop asking why or what or how, when we stop being curious about things, when we stop doubting what we've always been told. Our gospel reading this morning tells us the story of the Apostle Thomas. I was not named after him, I don't think. It was named after an uncle, a distant uncle. Thomas, however, I avoided just now calling him Doubting Thomas. Thomas has gotten a bad rap, I think. Over the centuries, we've attached that label to his name. Doubting Thomas, we call him. And preachers tend to scold him over and over about, not believing when the other disciples told him about seeing the risen Lord. But as Barbara Brown Taylor observes in that interview with Bob Abernathy, maybe it's not our doubts that are a threat to our faith, as much as sometimes our certainties. Maybe it's not our doubts that are a threat to our faith, as much as our refusal to question things and ask and wonder and be curious. I once took a course in leadership coaching. And one of the first assignments for us was to open the doors of our kitchen sink, and be curious about everything that was stored under there. It was really an interesting exercise. We put stuff somewhere and then we don't ask questions about it anymore. Doubt, like Thomas, prods us to grow by challenging old certainties that we've allowed to become sort of idols to us, standing in our way of going deeper into God. As the poet Rilke once wrote about doubt, be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart and learn to love the questions themselves. We don't know why Thomas wasn't in that locked upper room when Jesus came that first Easter night to the other disciples who were locked behind the doors. Maybe he wasn't there because he was the only one that wasn't completely frightened witless at what they'd all been through in the previous week with Jesus' arrest and torture and crucifixion. Maybe he'd gone out to buy some groceries or get some news about what was happening. We don't know why he wasn't there. Maybe he was just taking a walk to clear his mind and escape some of the doom scrolling that everyone else in that locked room was doing. Actually, if you think about it, John's gospel doesn't exactly paint the other disciples of paragons of faithful belief. They've run away, they're hiding behind locked doors, they're afraid to show themselves. They're not exactly profiles in courage. Thomas's questions and doubts maybe are a better response than the rest of the disciples' fear and anxiety. So the first lesson we might learn from today's gospel is to remind us that doubt is not a failure of faith, but doubt is integral to a growing faith. Curiosity about what we believe and why and where it came from, why we do what we do. Those are good things to ask. There's a second lesson, I think, that this passage teaches us, and it is a reminder that those disciples were locked behind closed doors because they were afraid and anxious about what might happen next. They were dispirited, discouraged, and in the cocoon of that safe, locked space, it's then that Christ comes to them breathing peace and courage. And that's certainly a message the contemporary church needs to hear. It's easy to be dispirited. I read a story last week in the New York Times, and it was about how school absenteeism rates have dramatically increased since the pandemic. There are fewer kids that ought to be in school who just aren't there. They're staying home or not going to school at all. And it's affecting learning goals and the achievement of learning goals we have for our children and young people. The researchers the article's authors interviewed attribute it to kids getting used to staying home rather than going to school during the pandemic. You know something about this? Some of you are teachers. And another factor, they said, now that we're back at school, they go to their classrooms, the kids who do go, look around, and they see their friends aren't there, and they wonder, well, why should I be here? Or they look around the room, and because there's no one there, some of the friends and the activities that were social aren't there, and that discourages them from going. If no one else is going, why should I? And so the article goes on to say that this is part of the problem, and the schools are trying to address it. And as I read that article, I thought about churches. I thought about so many congregations I'm familiar with or know about where worship and education programs have never gone back to where they were pre-COVID. And probably it's many of the same reasons that account for why there are fewer kids going to school compared to pre-pandemic. It's easy to look around and feel dispirited, discouraged. Where is everyone gone? And it's easy then to kind of cocoon in and stop thinking about the future because the future is worrisome. And I think what Jesus coming to those dispirited, discouraged disciples who'd locked themselves in to feel safe is a warning to us not to give in to our anxieties or discouragement against hiding in a cloud and a dream of how it used to be, but probably is never coming back. The risen one still comes to us in our dispirited and uncertain moments. He comes among us and finds us worrying about money and the future, worrying about numbers and programs. And he says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And if that's not good news to us, I don't know what is. There's a third lesson, I think, in this story of Thomas. It's in that invitation Thomas gives to touch his wounded side and his scarred hands. Being risen to new life doesn't mean we no longer bear the scars of our former lives with all their challenges and disappointments. Even Christ, in his risen body, still bears the wounds and scars of his old life. We are resurrection people, but we're also people scarred by life. And it's not in spite of his scars, but through his scars that Jesus opened a way for Thomas, touching his broken body, could find his way to wholeness. Back in the winter, I watched a movie I picked up at our local library. It was called Revoir Paris, to see Paris again. And it's French, it has subtitles. But it follows a young woman who had gone into a restaurant to get out of a thunderstorm on the night of the Bataclan terrorist attack in Paris that killed 100 people or more. And she's caught up in the terror attack, blacks out, and can't remember really what happened. The opening scene of it shows her in a doctor's office with putting her sweater back on with a scar from the wound she received in the attack. And the whole movie follows this young woman as she tries to remember what happened to her and put her life back together with this scar on her side. And she becomes part of a community of the other people who are trying to do the same thing. Sometimes, apparently, when people have severe trauma, They just can't remember what happened to them. Sort of like in a bad car accident, you black out, you can't remember. And gradually, the restaurant where the attack happened closed on Mondays so that those who had survived or the families of those who didn't could come back and look at the place and try to piece together what had happened to them. And she begins to form a community of people who are likewise scarred by what happened. A man who walks with crutches because his legs have been badly shattered by the attack. A young teenager who refused to go with her parents to see a museum and then had gone out to dinner at this restaurant and died there. And she never said goodbye to them. And the last words were harsh. I'm not going with you. And all of these people bear physical and emotional scars from this terror attack. And it's through their sharing of the reality of their scars with one another that they begin to heal, that they begin to come back to life. And one of the most powerful scenes for me watching it is there's kind of a love interest that develops between this woman who's been badly scarred and a man who's severely injured as well. They've both lost their partners because their partners couldn't deal with their injuries. And they finally come together, and there's a sort of scene where he starts to disrobe her, and she says, "No, I have a scar there." And he says, "It doesn't matter." And the touching scene is he has removed his shirt, and she leans over, and he has on his shoulder a terrible scar. And she leans over and kisses the scar, kisses it tenderly. It's through the scars, through their being able to acknowledge one another's scars, that they find healing. We're tempted often to hide our scars, to not let other people know the places we've been deeply wounded by life. But it's through sharing them and then being accepted often that our deepest healing happens. Isn't that what the church is meant to do? To let the world know that through God's wounded one, through a community of people that hold space for the wounded and the scarred and the skeptical and the doubting, that Jesus comes to us not in spite of all the scars we bear across a lifetime, but through them. It's in the tender, sometimes broken places of our lives that Christ is present, inviting us to touch his wounds and come near to them, that ours might be healed. And that's why Jesus left us this meal, to make his presence real among us. He comes among us at this table and invites us to touch his wounded, scarred body in broken bread and poured wine, so that he may breathe once more his peace and his healing, his strength for tomorrow's uncertainties into us, that we might now and always be his Easter people. Amen.